Jennifer, thank you so much for coming. Thanks to Flyleaf for hosting. I just have to take a second to give a little more information about Danielle, because we just went right over that MacArthur Fellowship, which for those of you, Genius Grant, also known as Genius Grant. Thank you, Danielle.
This is what happens when your friend introduces you.
Yes,
you know what I'm saying? They have that moment with you.
It does. So Danielle's actually first book, Hate Crimes in Cyberspace, is what made me a fan. I was a fan from afar, and I have been so glad to have the opportunity to intersect in our professional capacities. But Danielle's books, which there are now 2, are great. She's a teacher, that's great. But I wanted to mention another aspect, which is I read this word the other day in an email, I think it was from a law school, and the term was change maker. That's Danielle. And that, I mean, she doesn't just sit around and think about ideas and write them down in a book and hope other people read them. She works with governments here and elsewhere. She works with companies. And because of her and the work that she's done with Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, we now have laws that protect people in 48 states that we just didn't even have 3 or 4 years ago. So making change should, in my view, be everybody's goal, and Danielle is amazing at making change. So I'm so glad you're here to talk about your book.
Oh my gosh, I'm now blushing. You know I'm going to get right back at you, though, at some point.
At some point, but we have...
You'll let me know if I have permission.
So many questions we want to talk to. So some of the folks here have already read your book, but some are just getting their hands on it for the first time.
Yeah.
And so the fight for privacy is the focus here is intimate privacy. And just so we're all on the same page, I thought it would be great if you could just give us an introduction. What does intimate privacy even mean?
Of course. So intimate privacy is the privacy that we afford both access to and information about our bodies, our health, our innermost thoughts, which we share all day long without realizing it, right? We're browsing, we're searching, we're reading, we're texting, we're communicating our innermost thoughts and fantasies, our sexual orientation, our sexual activities and gender, and our close relationships. So it's the sort of how we manage the boundaries around intimate life. So that's just, and I make the case in the book for intimate privacy to be understood as a moral right, as a fundamental human right, and as a civil right. And I know we're going to dig into the details of some of that, but it's, the very notion, the whole heart of the book is about why intimate privacy is special, that we should treat it as a foundational value and afford special protection.
So, one of the great things about your book, in the very first chapters, is the layout. And we have 3 chapters. The first one, which I love, titled Spying Inc. And that one talks about corporate surveillance. And I like how you point out how there are different threat vectors and different threats to our privacy, some from corporations, some from individuals, some from the government. So could we just start out talking about what are the corporate threats? What does that even mean for a corporation to threaten privacy?
Right, because we might say, like, we assume, of course, that when we browse and click, how is that really intimate data? But so whenever, all day long, as we are, you're talking to your Alexa Echo in your kitchen, let's say, and I'm going to try to have you not have one of those things. But if you did, right, as you search, let's say you're searching videos on an adult site, you're using a dating app, which 2/3 of all young people do, right? You are using you have a health app on your watch. You have a period tracking app. 2/3 of all women and girls use some form of a period tracking app. And so 87% of those period tracking apps are sharing that information with third parties. So that includes not only advertisers and marketers, but data brokers. So, so all these, the tools that are embedded in everyday life that tell us these tools and services are good for you. They're going to make your life easier and better. They're also essentially free, or if they're free, they're low cost. They're not really low cost. Our intimate data is the gold mine. And so our information about our bodies, about the videos we're watching on adult sites, all of our communications on our dating apps, our health and Fitbits, our browsing and reading. We're on WebMD, right? We are reading and searching about our health conditions, chronic health conditions, and we think, oh, no one's going to know but me and WebMD, you and WebMD, and 4,000 advertisers, marketers, and then in turn 4,000 data brokers who are then selling it on ad infinitum. So much of what we leave behind, we don't have a visceral sense of our data as it flies out of our fingertips, of course, and leaving our heads. But so we don't experience it viscerally when we share it. But we are sharing so much of our intimate life really on a constant basis as we are, texting its companies, right, industry, ferrying those messages, storing those messages, collecting those messages. Maybe the metadata is being shared and mined and sold. And so spying, the idea, right, was to capture, Shoshana Zuboff calls it surveillance capitalism, or Julie Cohen, informational capitalism. So it's we all know that our data is the currency, but what I don't think we realize is that all the ways in which our intimate information that we share can be used in ways that we have no idea. So our life insurance premiums may escalate, and we don't realize, but it's the intimate data that we're being ranked and assessed and scored, because we're assessed to be scored as having a chronic disease in so many years, right? So we don't know that our premiums are going up because we are being so assessed as having this kind of risk, but we are, right? And third-party hiring services are used by firms to decide who to interview people, right? I see Ifoma Joy, who's like the expert on worker surveillance, right? In the audience, no pressure on me or anything to have me here, right? But those third-party hiring services are making decisions about who gets interviews and who doesn't. And our intimate data, so if you spend, let's say, 4 hours on watching adult videos, it was COVID, you had a lot of time. I'm just saying, friends, so everyone who tells me they don't know anyone who's been on Pornhub, and I say, you're ridiculous, because 87 billion people were on Pornhub last year. That's more than the number of people on the planet. So clearly everyone has been on Pornhub. But, let's say an employer has bought from a data broker, Dossier, there are 10,000 data points on each and every one of us. So we are ranked and categorized and scored based on how often we spend on adult sites. Are we sex toy users? Have we ever been sexually assaulted? Have we ever had a miscarriage or an abortion? Do we have type 1 or type 2 diabetes? So that is you might think, how are there 10,000 data points on me? I'm not that interesting. You are interesting. What we're measuring are how costly you are, how costly you're going to be to insure, how costly are you going to be to hire, and those metrics are usable, and they are being used. So that's the kind of the I can give an example. I feel like it's really difficult in the work that we do with data privacy. I see a lot of our students here and colleagues. So often I think without telling stories about people's experiences, it's really hard because it seems like it's so abstract and intangible. But to tell, so for me, so for the book, I interviewed 60 people from Iceland, the United States, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and India. And in understanding their experiences and the fullness of the suffering, and we'll get into that when we talk about individual perpetrators, but it's only in I think, really understanding the fullness of people's experiences that we can come to understand it. So I'm just going to give, for Spying Inc., Monsignor Jeffrey Burrell was an administrator for the American, I want to say like the Catholic Bishops Association. So it's largely an administrative job. He had a parish, but he no longer had a parish. He's working as an administrator. And during his travels as an administrator, he would use Grindr, which is a gay dating app. And he would, so over time, Grindr was selling people's location data, anonymized, but also with their mobile ID identifier. And so a Catholic news organization or app called, I guess it's a website called The Pillar, bought information from a location data broker and found that, because you easily re-identify yourself because you go home. So you use an app to go to a bar and then you go back home. So it's easy to figure out, who you are with your location. It reveals incredibly intimate information. So The Pillar told his boss, the administrator, that he was using, that he was using Grindr, going to gay bars, and he was allowed to resign. But the news site wrote a story about him and how he was going to gay bars. And so, his life as he knew it, right, as an administrator and as a Monsignor was done, right? And so that's, I think, a helpful illustration of what may seem bloodless as being full of suffering.
And can you clarify too, so corporations are often gathering this data. Data brokers end up with the data.
Yeah.
Who can get that data from data brokers?
Right. I mean, what is infuriating and terrifying all at the same time is that the enormous power that data brokers have over our lives and their woeful underregulation. And so anyone can buy it, but who is the biggest customer of data brokers? Law enforcement, right? So their biggest clients are state, local, federal, and federal agencies, as well as the FBI, right? It's not just all forms of domestic law enforcement, but federal agencies like ICE and other important agencies. They're the biggest clients, but also their clients are banks. Their clients are third-party hiring services. And there are some laws that restrict some of should restrain. The Fair Credit Reporting Act should be a barrier and should restrain them, but it of course doesn't. And so, buying these are all types of private and public actors. Universities are buying data broker dossiers, and they're considering giving out scholarships. So it's, I always think we should pause when we say law enforcement. And I know Professor Dellinger, I know Jolynn's going to be asking me, and we're going to talk about her deep interest in reproductive health and data post-Dobbs. But, indeed, here we are in an era where the fear that, of course, law enforcement is buying our intimate data in a way that before the book was at the printer in May, right, when the leak of Dobbs comes down. Now, I guess, having talked to you about this, we kind of saw the writing on the wall, but now the stakes are always high and were high when I wrote this book. And now the stakes are even higher. That is when women make choices about their reproductive lives. That data can be used against women to prosecute them, to bring lawsuits for civil penalties against them, and to be used by their providers to say, see, I didn't terminate a pregnancy in violation of the law. So there are all sorts of weird, perverse incentives about how this data is operating.
So let's clarify one other thing, just in case there's confusion. So you've mentioned a lot of health data.
Yeah.
Whether it's things that people put on a femtech app or conditions that they may have, medical conditions, and data brokers are trading in this. And so some people may be thinking, well, but HIPAA, because I go to the doctor, I have to read all those HIPAA notices. So why is that even allowed?
Right, because HIPAA doesn't apply. HIPAA actually can be understood as a pretty terrific law, right? We have to sit and have a moment, and if our data is going to be shared with third parties, if you're a covered entity, you have to get written permission for us to then share it with a third party. And usually it's in context where you actually have to think about it. But HIPAA has no application to your watch, your Fitbit, your period tracking app. The FTC's made some noise about how the revision to the High-Tech Act, which would require you to give notice that you're sharing with third parties as if it's like a breach. That makes no sense. And so we're trying to what do they say, put a Band-Aid on a mess, where a bomb has been let off. HIPAA doesn't apply. So it provides no protection. So Clue and every other, so 87% of the free period tracking apps that are now available post-Dobbs are sharing your intimate data with third parties, advertisers, marketers, and data brokers. And so HIPAA is no bar to that.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to be clear on that. So you also mentioned Pornhub, and I think it's a good transition into the individual, the threats that individuals can pose to our privacy, our sexual privacy, because not everything on Pornhub is there with the consent of the people who are in those videos. So could you just transition us a little bit with some more examples about how individuals are threats to other individuals, and are we really private in that locker room?
Yes. So thank you so much for the question, and to tying it helpfully to Pornhub. So I'm going to tell you about Joan. She was a recent graduate of law school. I'm using a pseudonym for her. But she was with her senior associate. They went off, took an airplane to take a deposition of a client, stayed 2 nights in a hotel. And when she got back home, it's a city where she lived, she got an email from someone named Not a Bad Guy Too. And the email had a link to Pornhub, and it was a video of her going to the bathroom and showering in that hotel room that she just stayed in. And the email said, unless you want me to share this further than Pornhub and share it with all your family and your friends and your law school classmates, you're going to send me more nude photos and a video of you masturbating. So she called her mentor from law school, who called me. I got on the phone with Joan. I said, Joan, you're not sharing anything. She said, of course I'm not. We're not sharing. And what I explained is what he had done is two different types of intimate privacy violations. He had taped her in the bathroom without her consent, video voyeurism, and he had attempted to extort her using sexual imagery. We call it sextortion, or an attempt at sextortion. So she didn't send him, images or videos, and he was good to his word. And I'm going to say he, because statistically speaking, it's probably a he, though we haven't caught him. And I can explain a little bit about the sort of who is suffering intimate privacy violations. The 48 hours passes, and an email is then sent out that looks like it comes from Joan. So it looks like it's Joan's first name and last name, but it's of course written by this individual. It's sent to we presume that this person mined her LinkedIn contacts, because all of her colleagues from law school, all of her, friends in her life who were connected with her on LinkedIn, all of her coworkers at the firm, all of her, her boss, were sent a video that looked like it came from Joan, with links not only to the Pornhub video, which had her name embedded in the video, so like her full first name and last name, but other adult sites, and then adult friend finder sites where the suggestion was that she was available for sex, included her cell phone number. And so in this email, what it says from Joan, obviously it's not Joan, but it says, this is my natural state, what do you think? So, she's got to go into work the next day and explain to her boss what's going on. And the boss was really lovely and really helpful. But as Joan explained to me, she saw herself through his eyes, right? I'm no longer Joan, I'm a body showering, urinating, taking off my clothes right in front of the mirror. I'm not me, I'm just a body, right? I felt like I was no longer a full person. I knew how this person saw me. And it became sort of months of trying to get the video taken down, which was a nightmare. No one responded to Joan. We're going to talk about a law that enables these sites to totally ignore and blow off requests. The only site to respond to her was a site operator located in Russia who said, if you send me more nude videos, I'll take it down. So she's she's vulnerable to more sextortion. Pornhub helped her twice, took it down, but the third time they had enough of her, they stopped responding to her requests. And it turned her life upside down. To say that, Joe would explain, there was kind of like a before and after, sort of before the leak of the video, and then kind of her life where she felt really good about herself. There were what do they say, possibilities. It was all possibilities. She wanted to clerk for a federal judge after 2 years. She had been on her law review. She felt like that was a real possibility. But she felt like at that point it was all over, right? She was on a knife's edge. She couldn't, in her own mind, lose her job, because how was she ever going to find a new one and explain to a law firm with its own interests and clients, right? Hire me. She couldn't imagine having that conversation. And what's really interesting in interviewing the 60 people that I did is that there's recurring themes as you talk. Almost feel like you're hearing a playbook. But as Joan said to me, she lost a tremendous amount of weight. She sort of was so thin when I met her in person. And victims explain they either lose a lot of weight or gain a lot of weight because they want to be unrecognizable. Like, I'm not that person. That was that other person, right? And Joan got a tattoo, and she explained it was her grandmother's name she had tattooed on her wrist, and she said, I feel like it's now my body again. Like, I'm taking it back. And she has this lovely fiance, and they were supposed to get married at the time that this happens, and they put it off for about 3 years because she's like, I can't have a wedding and invite, like, she could barely tell her parents because she wasn't close with them, and she felt like, I cannot go to them, let alone have them and get married in front of these folks. So they put off getting married. They finally got married. They put off having children this whole time. She just couldn't, she doesn't feel together, right? And every time Joan explains, like, her phone gets wonky, she thinks this person's back, right? And she said, I know I'm being paranoid. She goes to her therapist. She's like, it's PTSD. She feels like nothing's safe. You know, like, even walking down the street in this big city where she lived, she felt like she needed, you know, a good friend picked her up to go to CrossFit when she would get home at like 9:30 at night. She would go work out, like, but she felt like she couldn't walk alone. So, you know, this kind of, so an intimate privacy violation, you can do it in all sorts of ways. Perpetrators are incredibly creative. So now people take photos up your skirt and down your blouse. Not only do they engage in video voyeurism and sextortion, they then post the videos online without your permission. So Jolynn, you said wisely, like, not everything you see on Pornhub is consensual. And in fact, that's not only right, but if the searches themselves reveal them to be non-consensual intimate imagery. So teen crying is one of the most popular searches on Pornhub, right? Like, isn't that enough said that this is not consensual activity here? You know, the ways in which it impacts people's, you know, whole life experiences, more often the victims are women and minorities. And so, like, culture for culture, I have to say this, so the experience, so and you name it, technology, deepfake sex videos, like, we're gonna put it to use to invade intimate privacy. You know, you know, you name the society. So I work really closely with the Digital Sex Crime Information Commissioner in South Korea. So the problem in South Korea is the problem in Singapore, is the problem in Israel, is the problem in India and Australia and New Zealand, and you name the country. And misogyny is kind of the through line. Though culture for culture, of course, we other people in different ways, right? So the second biggest group of individuals are LGBTQ individuals, and their whole website's devoted to, you know, individuals with male genitalia, so like gay and queer men, and it's sort of broken down by city, college. Grindr handles are a must. Like, then the next question is, like, what's his name? Where does he live? Where does he work? Have you slept with him? And there are 9,500 sites whose entire purpose is the exploitation of intimate imagery. And I know we're going to talk about why that's the case. That is, how do these, you know, not get sued out of existence, and we're going to explain why. Most of them are located in the United States. But it is, for me, as I was doing these interviews, it felt, you know, you might think, like, oh, it's going to be culturally really different to talk to 8 people from Iceland. And the similarities were so profound, right? Talking to someone from Israel, interviewing Rana Ayub, a journalist from India, you know, of her experience with a deepfake sex video, which was the story of a government actor targeting her.
And do you want to just say what a deepfake is?
Oh yeah, I was just thinking that, totally. So it is digitally manipulated audio or video that shows you doing or saying something that you never did or said. And they're hyper realistic. So either you take a video that already exists, pornography that already exists, and you morph someone's face into porn, or you can create out of digital whole cloth video. You know, we're using generative adversarial networks, sophisticated machine learning technology that enables us to create these really hyper realistic videos that computer scientists who I work really closely with, like Hani Farid, say soon enough, it'll be impossible to detect real from fake using the technology. Sure, we can always do some journalism. You know, like, were you there at the time? We have to do some hard work to figure out, like, journalism, who, where, how. We can figure out later after the fact. But technologists say increasingly, like, we will get to the point where they're so realistic that you can't tell the difference between the fake and the real.
So there's so many more topics we could talk about in individual, but I just wanted to take up that point that you mentioned about the government.
Yes.
And some people, you'll say, well, privacy is necessary for democracy. And then you have to spend a lot of time explaining how you got from point A to point B. But I just wish you could talk about the governments that have used these deepfakes or blackmail with sexually intimate information, videos, pictures of people who are criticizing the government. Yeah. And, you know, back we have what the FBI did with Martin Luther King here in the United States, but even more recently, some of these newer technologies. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So Rana Ayub is a journalist in India who's she exposes human rights abuses, and as a Muslim woman has been exposing human rights abuses of the Muslim community in India. So she's a persistent thorn in the side of the Modi regime, ultra-nationalist government. And in April of 2018, she had a source in the Modi government. She was sitting at a cafe with a friend, so she got a ping from her phone from the source that said, check your phone. Retaliation has started. It was a week before she had been on BBC America criticizing the Modi regime. She'd done a lot of writing about the Modi regime in Indian outlets, but she hadn't been on BBC America. And I think that was just like the what do they say, the bridge too far for criticism. A deep fake, so a video of her that looked like she was engaged in a sex act. She's like beautiful, big eyes and curly hair. So if you look at the clip, it is her engaged in a sex act. It's not. She never engaged in a sex act. She never let anyone tape her engaged in a sex act. But it was, the Modi regime releases it on Twitter and it goes viral. And in 48 hours, it's on half of the phones in India. That's a lot of phones, right? There are a lot of people with phones in India, right? And so of course, her Twitter feed blows up and it's all individuals saying, I want to have sex with you. People doxed her, so they revealed her home address that she lived with her parents. She was 31 at the time, living with her folks. It's a very traditional society, so she hadn't yet married, and the kind of wrath that she faced, death and rape threats, her inbox was filled with abuse. She basically had to shut down all of her social media and all her email, her cell phone, because everything was a vector to get in touch with her and threaten her with rape and death. If the goal was to silence her, the Modi regime achieved its goal. She didn't write for 6 months. She stayed in her house for 6 months. And she felt like, as she explained to me, that there were millions of eyes on her naked body, even though she understood it wasn't her body. But once you see the video, and we sat together and she showed me the clip, it's her. Right? Once you see it, she's like, I can't shake it from my memory. And everyone else who sees it thinks it's her. It was unmistakably her in everyone else's mind. So, the notion of silencing critics, dissenters, journalists, using things like Grindr and location information in Egypt, identify activists, gay activists, and throw them in jail for their sexuality and sexual intimacy. There are other authoritarian regimes that have used doctored intimate images and to silence and to intimidate and to say, if you write that story, more is to come. What's interesting is that Putin is where he is now because of a fake sex tape, right? So you might think, really? When Yeltsin, in the sort of waning days of the Yeltsin regime, his family was being investigated for corruption. And the prosecutor in charge of the corruption, what Putin figured out was, all right, I'm going to make sure I'm going to completely defang this prosecutor. So created a fake sex video showing the prosecutor it was really grainy, so it made it seem like the prosecutor was having sex with someone, not his spouse. So the prosecutor resigns in ignominy and stops prosecuting the Yeltsin family. And who does Yeltsin tap to be his successor? Is Putin, right? So the story of intimate compromat is old. This was in the 1990s. This is not a new story, right? This is an old story, but these tools are pervasive. And because now, if you think journalists, you make your living used to be on Twitter, now like bye-bye Twitter, but social media tools are indispensable if you want to make a living in journalism. It's still true. It may not be Twitter. It may be something else. We'll see what's next. But you need a presence, right? And so it is a vector of vulnerability for you, right? Any of these tools.
So one other point on the government, which is taking a little bit of a shift, but in terms of just kind of bureaucracy and data collection, you mentioned earlier about people in marginalized groups, oppressed populations, being even more vulnerable to privacy harms. So can you talk about that aspect of the government's collection of data about people somewhat related to reproductive health?
That's right.
As well.
Yeah, so Kiara Bridges is a law professor, anthropologist at Berkeley, who embedded in a New York hospital, a public hospital. And what she found is that both under the New York and California Medicaid regulations, that poor mothers or poor expecting mothers, girls, and anyone expecting pregnancy getting Medicaid had to answer, according to the state regulation, a series of the most sensitive, invasive questions about their lives, which have absolutely nothing to do with a healthy pregnancy and the ability to parent. Like, have you ever been sexually assaulted? Have you ever been expelled from school? Have you ever been a prostitute? How many sexual partners have you had in your life? Have you ever had a sexually transmitted disease? The questions were, you think about, okay, so you need information, of course, for healthy pregnancy. There's lots of information that social workers and nurses need to get, and doctors, for healthy pregnancy. But the questions, and so required by the Medicaid regulations, so that have you ever had a tattoo? Where did you get your tattoo? So as when Dr. Bridges interviewed some of these expecting, women, the response was, it feels so demeaning. Like, there's no reason why you need to know where I got my tattoo. And if I have a tattoo, what does that have anything to do with my pregnancy? And what Dr. Bridges argues, and that I kind of echo and underscore in the book, is that it's what she calls the moral construction of poverty. That these individuals are poor, and they're mostly from Black and brown communities. And that what we're saying to these women when we're essentially interrogating them, because you can't not answer the questions. And in fact, if you don't answer the questions and don't get Medicaid, then you're under pervasive surveillance for having not gotten Medicaid and having not, gone to the doctor before you're pregnant, and then child services will be at your home and take away your baby. So you're sort of under surveillance of intimate life either way, she explains. And so, we treat people who are from marginalized communities as if they enjoy no privacy and aren't deserving of privacy. And that's true of the kind of hyper surveillance that we do in law enforcement, whether it's fusion centers, communities of color, and that sort of hyper surveillance of whether they're pervasive CCTV cameras. That is, life is, if you're not wealthy and you're from a marginalized community, you're viewed as suspect, inherently so. And so data is being collected about you in ways that aren't in wealthy communities, and makes your life like as if you're the totally transparent to government individual.
Hypervisible.
Yeah.
So now what we've seen, we've got these threats. We've got threats from government, we got threats from corporations, we got threats from individuals, all to our privacy, our intimate privacy. And this novel idea that you put forth in this book is conceptualizing privacy as a civil right. And that's really not how we've been looking at it in the past. And this would be a big change. And so can you just explain a little more about what that would mean and what that would require?
So just to underscore the shift, as you noted well, right? We treat the collection, use, and sharing of our information as a consumer protection matter. And so long as, I suppose, you don't lie about the data that you're collecting, and you're hide somewhere in some privacy policy on some website, you explain your practices, then for the most part, you're allowed to collect and share and sell our most intimate information. There are some pauses where it's like, there's some state laws, there's some small limits. We have amazing federal and state law enforcers. I've written a lot about state attorney generals the Federal Trade Commission. But that's not to say there are no limits. But for the most part, all of this collection of intimate data goes unimpeded because we're thinking about it as a consumer protection matter. And when so under that model, if it's good for a company and it seems like it's profit ensuring or securing, and we're not deceiving individuals, then we can do it under a consumer protection approach. What a civil rights approach would do is, I think, two important things. When you call something a civil right, what you're saying is that it's so important that it can't be taken away without a really darn good reason. Like when you have a civil right, it's not good enough for a company to say it's profitable. It makes things easy, more efficient, and administrable, right? A person can't say, I did it because like I was showing off for my friends. When something is a civil right, if you're going to invade that right, you need a really, it doesn't mean you can't ever have a good reason. You can have a good reason, but you need a really good one. It also means, and this is borrowed from the conception of the modern civil rights laws, and then there's a part of it that's borrowed from even earlier, like the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and some early interpretations of those laws. But under modern civil rights law, we think of, let's say, our university, our employer, the providers of public transportation as the guardians of our important rights, right? That they are the stewards of our important opportunities. So if you're an employer and there's sexual harassment in the workplace, you have a duty to be the guardian of that, of an individual who's experienced sexual harassment. And if you're in charge of public transportation, you have a duty to accommodate individuals with disabilities. That is, you are the guardian of their transportation opportunities. So when the shift, right, using this frame of you're in charge of an important right, and then you owe them duties as a guardian, as a steward, that would make anyone collecting our intimate information the guardians of that data, right? And once you're in that stewardship position, there's lots of ways we can borrow from modern civil rights laws, including an anti-discrimination mandate, but not only an anti-discrimination mandate. That is, we can require duties of loyalty, this relying on our colleagues and good friends, Neil Richardson, Woody Hartzog. Woody Hartzog, UNC, right? Here we are. Okay. I see his mentors and dear friends in the audience, right? Duties of loyalty, which means like you have to put the other person's interests first. You can't almost like deal against the individuals whose data you collect. And so it has both civil rights, calling something a civil right has both a practical payoff, but crucially an expressive one, right? It says to victims that they matter. It says to companies that you have to design your tools and services as the guardian of people's intimate privacy and with their intimate privacy in mind. And it also, there's another piece of it too that has an earlier vintage, which is when we once said something was a civil right, we meant that it's an opportunity for everyone to enjoy. So in the 1940s, the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division, when they were making the argument for civil rights, they were thinking about labor. That is, everybody had a right to work, and who was being especially denied the right to work were Black Americans. So that of course, anti-discrimination was a crucial part of the DOJ civil rights mandate, but it was also a right to protect labor unions, right, the right to work. And so I think in thinking about a civil right, it's got these two pieces, one of which is, of course, data stewards and special protections against discrimination, but it's also a right that everyone enjoys, that each and every one of us should enjoy intimate privacy, and that it's a foundational human and a civil right that I think is helpful both practically and as an educative manner.
Well, so when we're talking about rights, it seems like we like to think about privacy as a right. But we don't always have enough conversation about the corresponding obligations and responsibilities that we need people to live up to protect that privacy. And so I think that goes into a little bit your conversations that you've had with Congress and in the book about Section 230 and platform accountability, and what companies should need to do to get the benefits offered to them by that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And I know you might need to explain just a little bit about 230, but I think that would be a great topic to look into.
Great, and I know there are a few students in the audience who have written papers, as they told me when they said hello to me, about Section 230, and I was like, God bless you, I want to give you a hug. I'm sorry you had to do that. You know, I'm with you in your suffering. But Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, so it's a law passed in 1996 at the sort of burgeoning of the beginning of what we now know and understand as our digital age, right? The beginning of the commercial internet. This was a time when AOL and Prodigy were providing message boards. They were the only sort of on-ramp to online life, you know, they're early internet service providers. And there was an early decision. Is it okay if I take us back a little bit? Like, we have this federal law, but I think to explain that it provides an immunity, right, to website operators and other content platforms for user-generated content. I think I'm gonna, if it's okay, explain sort of some of the backstory, like of why we have this 230 thing, because it's pretty exceptional to provide a hall pass to online platforms, which is essentially what we've done is a subsidy of online platforms. They get to make a lot of money off of our data. They get to encourage illegality, and they get to get off scot-free. No liability, legal shield. So in 1995, though, there was this New York State Supreme Court decision, so the lower trial court decision in New York, where the court faced a defamation claim, so a case about, hey, you're spreading falsehoods about me, and it was on a message board, and the court found that Prodigy, this early internet service provider, because they were doing some filtering, they were filtering out dirty words essentially on their platform, because they were doing some filtering. The court said, because you tried to take down some of this content, we're going to treat you as a publisher and is strictly liable for all of the defamation that's posted on your site. And so, you know, in comparison to another decision that was around the same time, like if you did nothing and you just waited to be told about defamation, then you actually had less liability than if you tried really hard to be a good Samaritan, take down defamatory content or offensive content. And so so Ron Wyden and Chris Cox, two congressmen, you know, now we know Ron Wyden's a senator from Oregon, Chris Cox resigned from Congress, but when they together are really interested in all online tools. And apparently Chris Cox was an early user, as he says of himself, like of various, whether it's Prodigy, AOL, apparently he was on message boards, and was like, we've got to do something about this, because we want to make sure that these interactive computer services, that they try to take down some of the destruction online, because there's no chance federal agencies are going to be able to catch it all. They wanted to provide an incentive for companies to engage in moderation. So that certainly federal agencies certainly can't take down offensive speech because it would be against the First Amendment. But they wrote this thing called Section 230 of the Decency Act, and the subtitle is Good Samaritan, Blocking and Filtering of Offensive Speech, or content, I should say. So the idea was, like, if you're a good Samaritan and you leave up or take down in good faith information that ends up being destructive, then we're going to give you a legal shield. Now, really, it could have been interpreted pretty narrowly.
Yes, it could.
Right? Like, the very provision that we're talking about, it even doesn't say there are two parts that are relevant of the statute. One part has to do with taking down too much, which it says civil liability, and then it talks about providing an immunity for taking down too much content if you got to do it in good faith. The other part of the statute that we're often most focused on, because it's about leaving up content, it just said treatment as a publisher or speaker. Now, those are terms of art. They're terms of art when it comes to slander and libel. And the case that they were responding to, that they wanted to vanquish Cox and Wyden, was Stratton Oakmont versus Prodigy. So, you know, we could have interpreted this provision as saying, if you leave up information, if you leave up defamatory content, and you've tried to take it down but you don't catch it all, then you enjoy some legal shield, right? That could have been the interpretation. But instead, courts have interpreted in such an overbroad fashion so that any kind of legal claim, intentional infliction of emotional distress, civil rights litigation, you name it, whatever the claim is, courts, everything online really involves ultimately ones and zeros in many respects, right? Even brokering the sale of a gun. Courts have said that because it involves the publication of information, that you enjoy immunity from responsibility, even if the lawsuit is about enabling crime, right? Right, so selling destructive products, that is being treated with the legal shield, whose purpose was to encourage good faith or really good Samaritan self-monitoring, and in particular defamation. So it's been so interpreted in this overbroad fashion that even, so those 9,500 sites that I mentioned, they have the most uncreative names. It's like hidden cam, hidden camera, video voyeur 1, video voyeur 2. Like honestly, they're so boring. It's like Friends, really? Like uncreative, right? But they're really creative on how they get their users to post non-consensual intimate imagery, right? They have contests every week. They have prizes. They'll have themes like, slutty teacher week or whatever, but it's all clearly non-consensual intimate imagery. They're not even that explicit. It's just clearly that people aren't consenting. You know what I mean? Like that's the theme of these sites. And you might have thought, like, how are there 9,500 sites that are mostly hosted in the US? How do they operate? Aren't they sued out of existence? And my answer to you is, sadly, they can't be sued because courts interpret Section 230 of the Decency Act to apply to even sites that encourage, solicit, and keep up intimate privacy violations that know full well that this is non-consensual intimate imagery, that they get to be in the business of non-consensual intimate imagery and say, screw you, sue me. And when they're sued, courts say, oh, legal shield, you're immune from responsibility. So it's almost making a mockery, right? Cox and Wyden wanted to encourage self-monitoring, right? They wanted to ensure that you weren't punished for doing a good deed. And that's Good Samaritan blocking and filtering offensive content. That's the name of this provision, right? And it's being used to shelter and immunize the worst of the worst actors. And so some of what I've been working on, and with efforts to be as careful as I can be, so I'm always revising my proposals, and did again this summer, even after the book came out, I wrote a piece for BU Law Review called How to Fix Section 230, in which I, again, have made myself more narrow. Oh, we've got 10 minutes left. What I've been talking to lawmakers about on the Hill, and with other advocacy groups, is the notion of there should be no bad Samaritans. That's sites that solicit, keep up intimate privacy violations. They should never enjoy the immunity from responsibility. Like, we know the cost to civil rights and civil liberties that intimate privacy violations have. Like, they're making a joke of us. And that sites that involving claim, if the case involves intimate privacy violations and cyber stalking, that companies should have a duty of care to act responsibly and reasonably. And I lay out the 6 ways that Congress can explain how we can act responsibly and reasonably, because I've worked with companies for 12 years.
Change maker. See what I said about
Well,
change?
I don't know if they're going to buy this 230 thing, right? But I can at least tell them the 6 ways,
put it out
right?
there.
Yeah. So, having worked so hard with companies all these years on their community guidelines, and with their moderators and thinking with their policy folks, we know what it looks like to be responsible, right? So we need to change Section 230.
Okay, so I have a lot of questions about jobs. However, everyone in this room can undoubtedly come to Duke Law School and hear more about jobs next week.
Better take
And you all came here you all came here, so I want to make sure you all have a chance to ask questions. If anyone does, I know, thankfully, I see so many of my students in the audience. I know there's some students from Carolina, and you don't get too many opportunities to be in the same room with Danielle Citron. So if somebody does have a question, I'd love to turn the opportunity to you to ask.
Oh, come on, you have questions. I know you do. Yes, please.
So, like, at least for my age group, we always grew up with technology. So when it comes to like searching something or sharing information, it's just handing the phone over. So when companies acquire your information, how do they determine what's usable and what's not? Because if my search history is what my friend looked up on my phone yesterday when hers died, how's that applicable to me?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Of course, it's a great question, right? And with the more data that we have about you, we get to sort of weed out the chaff and know what's really about you than your friend. So it's amazing. So computer scientists tell us that even with enough prosaic information, like really prosaic, that we can infer the intimate. So soon enough, like what seems so prosaic, like, where I had lunch, what I order at lunch, what's my favorite movie, things that you wouldn't think tell the story about who you love, how you love, what's your fantasy, right? Those sorts of really, really sensitive information about your intimate life can be inferred. And so your question was like two parts, right? One is like the accuracy problem, right? Which was like, how accurate is this if it's so much data? And I guess we have data scientists who can tell you, oh, we can crunch a whole lot. That's what they do for a living, right? Is to make it useful. And so you have some of the smartest minds, and unfortunately working for private companies rather than, universities, but figuring out how your data is useful, right? And that's not to say that online behavioral advertising isn't total nonsense and snake oil, and I still think it is. Though they're good at my shoes, okay, what else are they good for? And Spotify's amazing, so good. But I tell them all the music I like, so of course they know. I love Beyonce, duh. But so there's some ways in which, the more we tell them, the more they know us. So then there's less of an accuracy problem, and the using it. What do they say? Like, I hate this phrase because it makes me cringe, but like, data is. This was like 10 years ago, people were saying it's the new oil, like with stars in their eyes. And I feel like we were probably at the same channel in which Chris Hofknuckle says he's going to throw up if he hears that one more time. Like, it's such nonsense, like it's the new oil. But it is, in many ways, we have based a whole business model on online behavioral advertising. And so, as you said so well, you use this concept of just searching is like giving you my entire phone, which is like giving you your entire life, right? Even the Supreme Court Justice Roberts recognizes, right, that, or his law clerk does, that your phone is I think he said something like the story of your soul. It's everything. It's your photos, your calendar. It's everything, right? It's your texts, your communications, like intimate life. Your phone there's the story, right? Much even more so than your diaries would have been, right? And whenever we used to have diaries, right? So, I don't think we're going to give up on the project. So we've got to limit the collection. And so much of what I do and think about is how to limit, minimize, and say either no collection or no sale. I'm no fun. Companies don't love me. Once I start not talking about safety, but talking about data privacy, they're like, yeah, whatever. Okay, lady, see you later. Yeah, we'll listen to you about safety, but, because that's their business model. Sadly, it's us, right? We're the product. We're being exploited, right? When they say we're users, no, we're being used, right? It's like baloney. I hate the word user. We're not users, we're individuals. Like, what is that? But it's clear we're being used, right?
Thank you so much for coming. I wanted to ask about algorithms. So how do you think about holding algorithms accountable for violations of sexual privacy, especially in terms of they're created by people but are entities evolving from people?
Okay, but people created them, right? We've long had struggled with various, what do they say, they're products that have many hands on them and many chains in the distribution. But responsibility, it's not the algorithm, so to speak, right? I feel like I'm in this great audience of people who've written about, books. Oh yeah, when is your book talk? Is it in May?
April.
Okay, April, just saying, Quantified Worker, right, is coming out in Cambridge Press. But algorithms, somebody has built them. Human beings, right, have built them. And data about human beings is used to train them. So, there isn't it's often the conversation we have about robots. Who is responsible for the robot? Somebody built the damn robot, right? So I don't even think it's not that it's not an easy problem sometimes, depending on how many cooks in the kitchen you have. But I think ultimately shared responsibility is a way we have to treat this. And so whoever's making money in the down of the line, like we need to have shared collective responsibility for those algorithms.
There's way in the back. Yep.
I work with Jolynn over at the Dark Blue School.
Oh, I like that. I went to Duke, so I sort of like that. We got dark blue and light blue, equally fabulous. Okay.
Thank you. So just some tactics that we can use to protect ourselves. I mean, I've watched every email. It's like go in and put it on the privacy setting that is the least. The least sharing privacy setting and things like that. What about things like DuckDuckGo and Brave as changing to those? How much does that really help?
Right. You could tell that I'm with you on the how much does it really help with the does it really help as the emphasis. But so my editors asked me to have a tip section in the book, which by the way at undergrad at Duke helped me write, Allie Ostat. I think in really modest steps, some tips can be helpful. So example, on your laptop, or I have a little dot on my phone, but like your camera on your laptop, sure, you can even use like a sticky. Like you don't even need I have a fancy UCLA, so a friend of mine gave me like a fabulous thing that now covers my camera on my laptop. But you can literally use a sticky. Like they're small, at the margins, there are small things that we can do. Having conversations with our partners about what we expect when we share images. I think often young people don't yet know how much they can really trust people before they, share information. And I just want us to be able to make sure we can trust the other people, right? Not just interpersonal advice, but there isn't a tech solution out of this one, right? So I have some tips in the book. I want us to, I always think like books and movies are kind of everything in how we think about our world. And so there's a book called The Missing Hours, which is about a sexual assault, the taping of that sexual assault and sharing of the video by Julia Dahl. She's an amazing mystery writer. And so I feel like that's such a great book to read, to have a real conversation with people about risks in everyday life. There's Dan Solo wrote a book for little kids about privacy, The Eyemonger. There are movies you can watch. I have a list for you about privacy and data surveillance. We need to have conversations with each other about our responsibilities to one another and our responsibilities as parents, and also of individuals with older people in our lives who are on their computers and they're doing some crazy stuff. And you know what? We need to talk to them too. One of my students said, how we have this is my free speech in the digital age class at BU Law School when I was there. And she said to me, how we get a license when you have to drive a car? Why don't we have a license to be on the internet? And I was like, I love you, Tara. So in a way we don't, right? And we need to educate each other. So the problem is structural. I don't want to depress you, but it is. And so we need law, industry, we need to bring our case, our, moral suasion to companies as law takes its time. There are little things we can do. And I think some of those little things have to be how we teach each other.
Maybe just one more if we have time, Kristen.
So we've talked a lot about the impacts on the individual, but I know that you have, at least at some point with Dan Solo, I've written about sort of the collective impacts of privacy. And so thinking about how it's a systemic problem, it also has systemic effects. And I kind of think of it like a little interconnected network, is that, if Professor Dellinger gets hacked, so does every email I've ever sent her, right? So I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, so that's right. We're all, privacy harms are the corrosive, that is, our vulnerability is a shared vulnerability, and in ways that we don't have a lot of resiliency for. And even as, I don't ever read the book Sandworm, or if you read it, brace yourself, because learning about NotPetya and realizing just how vulnerable we are, our networks, if we automate everything, then we won't have an electrical grid that we can fix, right? We're really vulnerable in all sorts of ways. And so the harms, especially privacy harms, they have both really real world, physical, tangible, the insecure database that leads to stalking, and identity theft that's really tangible, financial or physical harm. But the harms are often intangible, and they're no less potent, whether it's inequality, or it's emotional harms, autonomy harms. And I think we have to have a whole conversation about the harms to society, and as Professor Dellinger started us with, the harms to democracy. That I always feel like my privacy, I'm teaching a privacy doctrinal class, like it's a class about democracy at the end of the day and how we underprotect it in all sorts of ways. But like, how do you, Alicia Solos Niederman and I are writing our syllabus together, or did, and she's like, how do we tell our students it's about democracy and have them not like run out screaming because they want practical, practical tools. But it is true, like these larger structural commitments to human flourishing is what's on the line. And that's for all of us, all of our flourishing. So I guess we just have to keep talking about it.
Oh, I'm getting the
you out.
I'm getting the you out sign. We are done. I'm so sorry that we're done. And I'm so grateful to all of you for coming out to hear about this book and to learn about this topic. And my friends will tell you here in the front row that they never stop hearing about this topic. So to have a whole bunch of people like just come here voluntarily and be like, yay, privacy, is very exciting. And I'm so thrilled that you, Danielle, took your time to come down to North Carolina and talk about your book. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You're not going to invite everyone to Data Privacy Day? Oh, Data Privacy Day. Yay.
Thank you for asking.